All right, now continuing the discussion on last night's State of the Union address. Friends, I can tell you, as a member of Congress, I have been to many of these State of the Union addresses. And last night, to me, as I watched it, was unlike any State of the Union address I have ever witnessed. Always, just as an example, whoever is speaking throws a bone, if you will, throws to the opposite side of whichever party is there. But there are certain issues in a State of a Union that pull everybody together, things that both sides of the aisle stand up and applaud, things that all of Americans believe in, that we trust in, that we adhere to, that we all agree with. It's like that with all State of the Union addresses. It was not like that last night. Last night was full of anger. It was, I literally watched while I was taking notes. I wrote down literally, this seems like hate speech. It was like I was listening to the Hate of the Union address rather than the State of the Union. It was demeaning. It was attacking Republicans. It was attacking all conservatives. It was the Democratic side or nothing at all. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen last night. And it demonstrated just how far the president has fallen short of his own claims and promises to work to unite the country. That was the most divisive speech I've heard in a State of the Union ever. And yet the president said he was going to be the president of all. He was going to unite the country. So how should we view the address through the lens of Scripture? Well, joining me now to discuss this from a worldview perspective is David Closson. He, of course, is the director of the Center for Biblical Worldview here at FRC. David, welcome back to the program. Great to have you.
Thanks for having me. Great to be with you, Jody.
All right. So given all the talk of his age, the president was clearly last night trying to convey vigor and energy. But what came across, at least to me, was anger. Give me your thoughts on both the tone of the president's address and the reaction that it was intended to provoke.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Jody. I actually watched a couple hours of airtime and coverage prior to the State of the Union on CNN and other networks, and it was really incredible to me to see how kind of low the bar was set. And even Republicans, I think, fed into that. Just that as long as Joe Biden didn't get up there and fall over, I think people were going to say it was a success. And so from that, if that's your metric, I think sure it was a fine time. But what really struck out to me was how angry and loud and partisan he came across. I've been watching State of Unions my whole life, and the thought that came to me, Jody, is the folks who are going to write his speech at the Democrat National Convention really can take the summer off, because all he has to really do is give that same speech again, because it was so partisan. It was just overtly going through a checklist of the things on the Democrat Party's wish list. But specifically from a worldview perspective, that was helpful, Jody, was the priorities of this president. And I found it interesting that before he even, got to the issue of immigration and the border, which is on everyone's mind, he talked about every issue under the sun, including Snicker bars, until he even got to the issue that voters tell us is the number one issue on their minds. And so those are just a couple of things that stood out to me.
Yeah, great point. In fact, the whole speech started with the need for us to continue crazy support, outlandish continued support for Ukraine. And many of us were sitting there thinking, what about defending our own border? What about securing our own national security? And yet out of the gate, we're talking about we've got to defend the national security of Ukraine. But the president also addressed gender ideology. Yeah. He spoke directly about the Equality Act when talking about his desire to protect fundamental rights. You've written a lot about the Equality Act. Does the Equality Act in and of itself protect fundamental rights?
No. The Equality Act is one of the most egregious pieces of legislation ever proposed. And I know you know that, Jody. You voted against this when Nancy Pelosi when she brought it to the House of Representatives several cycles in a row. What the Equality Act does is it elevates the contested category of gender ideology to the same level as race and religion. One of my favorite things to point out, the Equality Act actually, is that it specifically exempts itself from the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which Congress passed and President Clinton signed into law in 1993. And so what that means, Jody, is whenever a claim of, again, very contested categories of gender ideology and sexual orientation, whenever those come into conflict with religious beliefs or religious doctrine, guess what? The gender ideology claim will trump. It'll win. And so this is just massively problematic for Christian colleges and universities, anyone that retains orthodox belief in human sexuality, because, again, those claims of gender ideology are always going to win if the Equality Act came into law. And I would just briefly add, this has implications for things like girls' safety, girls' sports, women's equality, because again, gender identity, just the idea that someone thinks they're the opposite gender than what they were born, well, those claims would receive preference in our law, and again, it would consign Orthodox, Bible-believing, gospel-believing Christians to a true second-class status in this country. And so the president didn't linger long on it. He spent way much more time on the culture of death and abortion, even chastising the Supreme Court and quoting to them in their face, which I found appalling, the Dobbs decision. But I think it is helpful to note, Jody, that he did go out of his way to highlight his support for, again, one of the most radical pieces of legislation ever proposed in this country, which is the Equality Act.
Yeah, it really is. And to watch the First Amendment literally being tossed out the window, and religious liberties, and those who believe certain biblical truths, you're trumped now with the all of that is tossed away for the sake of the Equality Act. It's just incredible. Well, the president also invoked a battle for the soul of the nation. I'd like to get your reaction to this. Play clip 6, please.
When you get to be my age, certain things become clearer than ever. I know the American story. Again and again, I've seen the contest between competing forces in the battle for the soul of our nation, between those who want to pull America back to the past and those who want to move America into the future.
All right, the battle for the soul of America, I would say that battle is much more involved than a battle for those who want to pull America back to the past versus those who want to pull it to the future, which that in itself is totally erroneous to even deal with it from that perspective. But give me your reaction, this whole battle for the soul of America.
Well, Jody, I agree with President Biden that there is a raging battle right now for the soul of this nation. I would just disagree with probably almost every one of his prescriptions. Again, what we saw last night, I think is so helpful with the State of the Union, although it really was just a campaign speech. It laid out his vision. It laid out the president's priorities. It laid out his worldview. It laid out for the whole nation to see what President Biden and his party believes is right and wrong, what should be morally permissible and what should be morally prohibited. It laid it out black and white, very clear, Jody. And again, for Bible-believing Christians, I think we'll find ourselves at odds with almost every policy prescription that the president laid out, which again, I say this every 2 and every 4 years, that elections have consequences, and that is so true because really the soul for this nation is at stake. But as we approach election time, as believers, we need to be making sure we're taking every thought captive to the Lord, looking at what His Word says. And I think we'll find as we do that, Jody, what we find in Scripture really does contradict a lot of the things that we heard from the House of Representatives last night.
Well, it certainly does. David Closson, I want to thank you so much. This is such valuable information, and I thank you for coming more and more on Washington Watch on our Friday programs to try to break down some of the important news that takes place during the week and to bring a biblical perspective and a biblical worldview into the whole dynamic of what's being discussed. And of course, today doing so with the State of the Union address, but I look forward to having you on more and more on Fridays to break this down from a biblical worldview perspective. David Closson, thank you so much for joining us on Washington Watch. Always great to have you.
Always a joy. Thank you so much, sir.